to your seats, we would appreciate it. In the meanwhile, we are going to play you a video from one of our title sponsors, Yardi Systems. We are very grateful for their support, and without further ado, hit it, Gavin.
Finding out I was awarded this scholarship my sophomore year to remove the doubt from my mind of whether or not I was going to be able to continue my education here at Morehouse College.
Yardi Scholars are first-generation college students with demonstrated financial need. The hope is that this program will allow young adults to have the opportunity to go to college, to have financial success, and to have careers that are meaningful to them.
Being a part of the Yardi program, I have the opportunity to learn so many different things that I would have never exposed myself to.
I just felt incredibly blessed that a scholarship program has recognized me.
The Yardi Scholarship has been the key to achieving my dreams and to also progress my self-development.
The Yardi Scholarship is an opportunity and a gift for growth.
That I got other people to believe in me and in my educational journey is everything.
As Chancellor, I'm delighted to mark the one-year anniversary of the Yardi Scholarship Program here at Cal.
The Yardi Scholarship Program is one of the most important things I've done in my time at Berkeley.
Yardi as a company is 40 years old, and Yardi has been giving back to the community for all 40 years.
I'm very grateful to Mr. Yardi. He's able to inspire us students to do good for society.
Thank you very much to Yardi Systems for their sponsorship of this conference. And thank you to all of you who continue to talk in the back of the class. Anybody? To your seats, please. Thank you very much. All righty, Mac.
All right, we'll give it showtime. We'll give a minute or so. Is it our time, Mac? Are we ready to go?
Yeah, we're ready. All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the annual Legislative Update Panel. Tonight we're going to talk, tonight.
Today, right?
We're going to be morning, we're going to talk about what's new in housing and what to expect in 2025. I'll be moderating this panel with my two esteemed colleagues and friends over here. My name is Matt Carlson. I'm a land use associate with Brownstein Hyatt, Farber and Schreck in our Santa Barbara office. My practice focuses on water and land use, and particularly lately around housing for public agencies, nonprofit client, and private clients. My esteemed panelists include Mr. Michael Gunning, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Lighthouse Public Affairs. Michael is a veteran of finance, housing, policy, insurance, community development investment in California with over 2 decades of experience working with the legislator. He's been appointed by 2 governors to serve on the California Housing Finance Agency, and most recently was appointed by Governor Newsom to the California State Teachers Retirement Board system. He's also an alumni of he was formerly the Senior Vice President of Legislative Affairs for the California Building Industry Association, CBIA.
Lindsay.
And then Steven Stenzler is a Senior Policy Advisor in the Brownstein Sacramento office. He advises clients on a variety of issues from housing, land use, tax policy, and emerging technologies. Prior to joining Brownstein, Steven served as the Chief of Staff for California Assembly Member Timothy Grayson, who is the chair of the Assembly Banking Committee. During his tenure with Assembly Member Grayson, Steven was the lead staffer on a number of impactful housing measures.
Good stuff.
So I will kick us off, and then dive into the questions for you all. As I think everyone in this room is aware, over the last 8 years, the legislators maintained a focus on housing legislation, passing hundreds of laws, creating new streamlined ministerial approval processes for developments, reducing local control over housing, and increasing state oversight over local agencies. 2024 was no exception. Although the legislature has passed significant housing legislation in these last 8 years, I don't think we've seen the significant expansion of housing supply throughout the state or locally. Commentators, including people like Ezra Klein, has often criticized California's housing policy approach as everything bagel liberalism, where state and local agencies had added many other goals, or seasonings, if you will, which are often laudable, like labor protections, inclusionary requirements, etc., but that seemingly reduce policy's overall effectiveness at its primary goal, in this case, delivering more housing. As we saw in 2024, voters are seemingly fatigued with this approach, given exit polling showing a general backlash towards incumbents, especially in cities. California's housing policy at the state and local level remains as critical as ever, which is why today I'm thrilled to discuss with Michael and Stephen what happened in 2024, what we can expect in 2025, and how a presence in Sacramento can help deliver affordable and workforce housing on the Central Coast. With that, I want to start off with some reflections from you two on the most recent elections, because I get to pick the question.
You're right.
And so for the first time I remember, housing became a presidential election issue. The Kamala Harris campaign proposed a plan to build 3 million new homes, which pales in comparison to Governor Newsom's claims previously to build 3.5 million in California. J.D. Vance proposed to open up federal land for housing development, and both parties raised concerns about institutional investors buying single-family homes. I think we've heard some questions about that today. I'd also want to highlight that several House members formed the first ever bipartisan YIMBY caucus. What, if anything, do you expect Sacramento and the state to take away from housing taking the national stage? Or are other places just catching up to California's housing woes? Start with you, Mike.
Go?
No, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mac and Stephen. Thanks. Great to be here. Great to be here with you all. Got a shout out to Beth and, of course, Lindy Hatcher at HBA. She runs that wonderful group up there. Slow. I think it continues. I don't see, as you guys appreciate, the elections were in November, and then this Monday they literally had, I call it the first day back of school, where all the new members get sworn in, and the families are there, and I was sharing with you, Dos, what it's like. Everyone's walking the streets there. I don't think it's going to stop. I think that the nation is recognizing, we heard from our previous speaker, that it is a national issue, and it's not just in California, it's all over. So I think, what goes on in California leads the nation, and we're going to continue to work on bills for housing. I mean, they were telling me that on Monday, right?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that I think a large factor in the election, both nationally and in California, was cost of living generally, and we know that housing is one of the biggest drivers on affordability for cost of living. So I think we're going to see across the board proposals based on not just housing, but things that are driving up costs in the grocery store and cars and insurance, all factors related to that, and I think housing is going to hitch a ride on that wave.
Yeah. There's clearly a recognition from the election that economics plays in, and so a lot of the conversation Monday was about things that are going to fuel the economy and help folks survive the economy. That's a good point.
I think we also heard from Governor Newsom immediately in the aftermath of the election that he wanted to call a special legislative session on safeguarding California values and fundamental rights. And then recently, too, the Strategic Growth Council, building on Executive Order N-2-24, requested input from public input on opportunities to streamline infill housing development across the state. Do you expect the governor and legislator to have dual priorities in 2025? The Trump administration and housing? Will one take priority over the other? What are you hearing?
Mac, I think he got a little pushback for coming out so soon. I think a lot of legislators, and maybe even the electorate, right? Do we have to do this right now? So I think what you've heard over the past week since he called for the special session was more of a, hey, we just want to give the Attorney General more money to sue the Trump administration. So I think he's not walking it back. They had the special session on Monday, and they introduced the bills, and so they're going to go through the process, and they'll probably pass early when they come back in January. But you can almost see, you can almost feel going back to the economics, doing more housing policy, and not necessarily the grand focus on suing the Trump administration.
And to add to that, I don't think they're separate priorities, because I think what's happening now is the governor is eyeing the national scene. I think we all know that. And folks are eyeing the governor's seat, which he's going to vacate. And I think everyone is seeing how housing has become, this larger national issue, and are thinking about how they can weave that into the federal situation, how they're going to push back on that. So I think as Newsom is kind of grappling with that, but also trying to hold up his commitment to 3.5 million units, or 2.5 million, depending on which day you ask, he's going to be, thinking about blending those two things.
All right, switching gears a little bit, at the state electoral level in the last couple of years, we saw an Our Neighborhood Voices ballot initiative fail to qualify. That's an initiative that would basically repeal all state housing laws since 2016. We also saw and voted on Proposition 5, which would lower voter approval requirements for affordable housing bonds, and Proposition 33, which would have repealed the Costa-Hawkins Housing Act and limits on rent control. How do you see these legislative outcomes shaping the legislator's housing policy in 2025?
Well, I will say, one measure that did not qualify this year was a housing affordability bond. There were a lot of discussions around that. There were a lot of bonds on the ballot. The school and the natural resources bond ended up moving forward, and they both passed. So I think that's going to be a focus for the legislature in the coming year, is working on more funding, especially as the state budget situation improves, but is not exactly rosy. Accessing other funding avenues for affordable housing, for home ownership, for preservation and redevelopment. That's going to be a major focus. But on the flip side, Prop 5 not passing kind of sends mixed messages to the legislature. It's like, we want to pass bonds, but we don't want to make it easier to pass bonds. So I think that's going to cause some reflection for the legislators.
Yeah, I think 5 failed, Mac, because of the economics, that folks appreciated how costly things were, and saw 5, as you said, Stephen, as a way to increase costs. So the juxtaposition of supporting schools but not giving cities the ability to increase taxes, I think spoke to really everyone's economics, and I think we saw it play out in the ballot.
Right. Well, I also want to touch on what happened in the 2024 legislation. I'll point everybody to the tables. My colleagues at Brownstein prepared a summary of key bills, which are on your tables in case we missed some of these. But I'm hoping to hear, I guess, Stephen from you, and then Michael, how would you describe the housing bill package in 2024? And could you talk through one or two noteworthy bills that you worked on and how those bills came together?
Sure. I would describe it as shoring up the streamlining regime that the legislature's been working on for the last few years. I think the general consensus is that the streamlining paths that were laid out in AB 2011 is the way forward now, and making that more effective, tweaking some of the requirements around that is really the only game in town when it comes to streamlining. So we saw a couple bills in that space from Assemblymember Wicks. And then the other side of that is, if we have solved the discretionary piece, now we have to tackle the hard costs of development. And that's something that I think we're going to see. We saw a focus this year, we're going to see a focus next year, is when the economic cycle comes around that there's going to be another development boom, we need to get all these different costs that are tacked on housing to come down. So one bill I had the privilege of working on was co-sponsored by one of Michael's clients, was about deferring impact fees until certificate of occupancy. This is a big cost up front for developers, and we, through talking with developers, realized that you could save about 1% by just deferring the fees until the development project is completed. Prior to this, developers are fronting the money for the fees when they have no collateral, they have no project to base it on, and so this is just going to require fees to be paid after the project's complete. And again, addressing the hard costs, and we can talk about the vagaries of passing that, but I'll tell you, it was not easy.
That's the fun part, Stephen. Come on now.
Well, you go for that.
That bill's impactful because it was paired with affordable housing, SB 973 by Scott Wiener, and then Joe Patterson's 27, 29?
You got it.
Hey, I remembered it. And like Stephen said, extended permits, but in the Senate, that was not going to get out. And it literally took some movement, should say, and interestingly, you know, strange bedfellows. So you have Scott Wiener, who everyone knows from San Francisco, and Nancy Skinner from Berkeley. And then you have Brian Dolly who ran for governor against Newsom, and Kelly Sayarto, and those two teamed up to move those permit extensions over the chair. You know, really big dynamics in Sacramento. So you can see where housing policy can bring strange bedfellows like it did on that one. We can't ignore Buffy Wick's cleanup to builder's remedy,
1893.
Thank you. And you mentioned streamlining 2011. We also increased ability to do malls or housing on malls and old sites happen. So it feels like cleanup legislation. I think a lot of, would you say, the low-hanging fruit is done. So we're really going in and fixing laws that need tightening up.
Great. I want to touch on a couple things there. I think you really highlighted streamlining bills, and you highlighted some legislators in San Francisco and the Bay Area. You know, from my experience here on the Central Coast, it seems like the legislation is really targeted towards Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego. Yeah. Are you seeing any momentum in the legislature to make bills more, or draft bills more tailored to areas outside of major cities, or will big cities continue to dictate the legislative agenda?
I think it's twofold. I think just because the people are in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and that's where the leadership comes from, right? Although now with Robert Rivas from San Benito County, we do have a rural speaker there. But I think folks have realized in California one size does not fit all. So I think while the concepts may come out of LA, San Francisco, trying to make them work in the Central Valley, in San Diego are also there. In fact, you are seeing some initiatives come out from the Central Valley that works for the Valley, not necessarily LA too. So you'll see some, but just because the ideas formulate there and get massaged through the process.
I will say, and I think we're going to touch on this a little later, but if people from the Central Coast or the Central Valley or the North Coast don't show up in the legislature and ask for their voices to be heard, LA and San Francisco will steamroll with their policies. And so it is important to raise the issues and show up.
Advocate.
So in terms of the sausage-making process, who all do you see the most of in terms of industry groups and helping craft these legislation? Outside of just the legislator. And I know this wasn't on our prep list, so I'm throwing you.
Hey, that's a curve, man. Come on, man. You know, that's you know, I call Sacramento the city of gangs, because you know you got to be in a gang in Sacramento or you get jumped, right? Whether you're in the oil industry, the home building industry, or the doctors or dentists, you have to belong to a trade association, because that's how you protect yourself or advocate for policies. You know, I see that those gangs that are up there, they're still influential, and I think they'll push on some of that. And of course, I've forgotten what your comment was.
Just wondering who's all getting to add everything into these bills that's not our legislative.
I think YIMBY's been good.
YIMBY's been good.
The HBA group we started.
I'm thinking, you know, who do I call when something drops? You've got nonprofit affordable developers, for-profit affordable developers, market rate advocates like YIMBY. You've got labor you've got to check in with. You've got environmental groups you've got to check in with. You've got the administration and the agency, housing and HCD, the accountability unit. You want to get their opinion on things. I think all of those, the GO, yeah. You know, you've got to check all those boxes when you're defending
and what you're seeing, labor is clearly a part of it. You can't do housing bills now without the carpenters, which is fascinating because it used to be the building trades, but now you're seeing more movement from the carpenters being involved in housing and trying to create roles for them there. So I'd almost put labor in there as the first ones to go. But YIMBY, I would say, has really moved the needle a lot. Their conversation, the local chapters, even old stalwarts like Habitat for Humanity also, right? Habitat tends to breathe a nicer face about ownership. We're trying to bring the ownership discussion as opposed to always about affordable rental.
And equity groups are getting engaged now on both sides. You've got equity groups like the 200 that are advocating for, economic mobility for minorities and saying that housing is the ladder to, get into economic stability and generational wealth and showing up in the Capitol. And then you've also got, environmental justice equity groups that are pushing back on the streamlining because they don't want housing to be too close to oil and gas. So it's, there's a lot of dynamics there. New players, old players, continuing to work together.
Does that get at it?
I think that was good. We'll probably get into some more of the weeds here as we go. The other question, and Shane Phillips touched on this, was ADUs, accessory dwelling units, have become incredibly popular, including here in Santa Barbara County. They were not as popular when they first came out, but I think that they've grown, and lots of people are implementing them in part because they're built by local residents, local homeowners, not developers, the dirty word. How do you see the success of that ADU program and some of the limitations of things like Senate Bill 9, which allows duplexes and lot splits, moving the legislator in terms of focusing on maybe things more like gentle density rather than these large ministerial streamline project bills?
It's funny you mentioned SB 9, which Tony Atkins' lot splitting bill. One of the conversations, session ends in September, and then you start doing all your planning through October, November, December. And so one of the comments we came up from one of our clients was, we need to make SB 9 like ADUs or lot splits like ADUs. So I think you're going to see that push this year to try to improve on 9 or how to make 9 work like ADUs did.
We were talking about this last night over drinks, and I think it's funny. Basically, ADUs, one of the most successful housing programs in the last decade. I think it was basically an accident by the legislature that it's as effective as it is, because other programs that we see get so watered down through the process that they end up not producing a lot of units, and we all see that no matter how many new laws come out. But ADUs have been really effective, and I think it was just a matter of the parties that were involved not really noticing how much it was going to be embraced by cities. And so we were talking about policy making by accident, but it was a happy accident that we're now actually producing units there. But it also speaks to somewhat of the dysfunction of the legislature that to get a good policy through, it has to kind of fly under the radar from some of the groups that are traditionally advocating against it.
All right, a little bit of a shifting gears, but Coastal Housing Coalition is obviously really focused on moderate income and workforce housing, since many of our South Coast residents fall into this category. It's also the category that doesn't receive really any subsidy or protections. Anything on the horizon to encourage workforce housing at the state level in 2025?
Yeah, I in your intro mentioned that I was on the State Housing Financing Agency, CalHFA. Fred White, who's on the board now, shared with me that CalHFA has a request for information out in the street to look at 120% workforce housing. So they're asking local jurisdictions to respond to this, to say, is this a need? I frankly can't believe that they got to ask that, but a state agency needs to have the data to justify a new program to support that. Speaking of ADUs, CalHFA came up with the grants, $25,000 to help folks do the pre-construction costs for ADUs. So now they're thinking about what can they do to jumpstart that. But I think there will be a bigger focus going forward, but there's resistance. The affordable side will push back on any kind of state subsidy that does not go to that sacred 80, right, low to mod, right? And now, in fact, a lot of the conversation is very low at VLI and excessive low income housing. Can't we push money that way as opposed to middle income, which is just bizarre to me.
Don't forget acutely low income.
Thank you, right? We got new categories.
Yes.
Instead of thinking about the money on this side, we think about, and rightfully, but there should be a balance, and that's what I think it's coming.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that moderate income is often used as a political football that gets tossed around.
For the rich.
It sounds really great for legislators to bring it up. Same thing with home ownership. homeownership gets brought up at the beginning of every legislation, and they talk about funding it, they talk about how important it is for economic mobility, and then when the chips are down and the budget comes out, they get almost nothing. And that often happens with workforce.
First thing gets cut when the governor does it is the housing cow home, right off the top. Always, we got to get it back in.
So I think reading your profiles, I think we hit on a couple other topics that sort of related to housing, but maybe don't get as much discussion, right? The banking aspect, the financing aspect, and the insurance aspect. I'm wondering if you could touch on projects you've worked on, bills you've worked on that sort of have this in those sectors that relate to and increase the production of housing.
Let me just say, no one knows more about insurance and housing than this man right here, so I'm just going to shut up and listen here.
Right there. Okay, who's seen their insurance premiums go up? Come on, everybody. It's all. Especially if you're trying to build. The insurance issue is tough. I used to represent insurance companies, and have been working with our insurance commissioner. The hard part is it takes a long time, right? So even though supposedly January 1, all of these new regulations are going to be in place that allow insurance companies to recoup some of these costs they've spent, will they come back to the market in January 1? No, because they're going to wait and see. So we're not going to see a fix immediately, like you pass a bill, a law, and the law changes. I think it's going to be gradual and slow. But insurance is an important aspect. We had a conversation this week about construction defect, for example. And this is what's weird. We all know that you build a project, particularly on condos, you get the letter from the attorney saying we're going to sue you for defect. So we try to think about fixing that law, but believe it or not, there's the devil you know is the devil you like. So you'd rather work with the existing right to cure as opposed to opening up construction defect, and it may change from how it's been since 2008. So while I think the cards are in place to improve insurance, it'll probably take another year before we do see those companies coming back, because they're trying to level set their books off of all the expenses that have gone and climate change. So it's not going to be immediate, but I think Ricardo Lara has made the right changes. It's just going to take a minute on the insurance side.
I've got a good cross-jurisdictional one. So this goes back to the hard costs and costs imposed by agencies. We talk to a lot of developers in the Bay Area that are getting additional costs from the Water Board, or getting it from the Department of Toxic Substances Control, the Air Resources Board. Not huge, but when you add them all up, it really restricts development. And so one thing that came up, and this was done in a trailer bill, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC, they had structural issues with their budget. So they had to rebalance the way that they charge fees on polluters, people who remediate soil from the ground. Developers are one group that remediates soil. If a lot of times, especially in the Bay Area, they're pulling up a lot of soil. It can have contaminants from the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, and they have to remediate it. It used to be capped at $100,000 for any size development. They removed that cap and put a new per ton fee structure into it. So this happened in a trailer bill, which was in print for 72 hours. Almost no one caught it. And next thing you know, developers are getting these bills. We had one developer with a large regional project go from a $100,000 bill to $20 million. Try putting that in your pro forma.
In the capital stack.
Yeah. So, and this was done, basically by the department with the blessing of the governor, without consulting with the folks on the ground who are really going to be doing it. And so we worked on a bill to roll that back. Given the budget situation, it didn't pass this year, but we're coming back again to try to work with DTSC to say, come on, the state has goals of building new housing. And you can't have one agency completely squashing the ability to do that in their lane and doing the best they can in their lane, but not thinking about the larger situation. And I think that's a theme that we're seeing throughout the legislature.
Great. So one thing we talked about a little bit last night was term limits, which I guess took effect about 12 years ago.
We had like a bender last night. We talked about that.
We practiced all right.
Yeah. So, term limits. We have a whole new class of legislators coming in. What are you hearing about their priorities? Any notable races? Any notable people that are targeting housing legislation. Any losses?
I don't know about you, but it seemed like everybody was asking, Gunning, I need a housing bill. We need a housing bill. Everyone needs to get a reputation, right, and build a bill. So this class, what you're referring to, term limits where you could serve 12 years, 3 4 years in the Senate, or 6 2 years in the Assembly, those guys elected in 2010 and 2012 termed out this election. So you have 37 new members coming in on both sides. I think we reached parity, ladies. We have 50% women and men now in our legislature. First time ever. Yep, hands out. But there was a real big thought about what can we do more on housing. And they're all asking, and that's why we talk about the low-hanging fruit. I think folks are also talking about economics. What can they do to improve folks' lives? One way we'd like to mention, of course, is David Alvarez from San Diego, who for 2 years now has introduced bills to the Coastal Commission. I think he's got seasoned now, and he's ready to bring it back one more time this year. So I know there will be legislation impacting how the Coastal Commission deals with housing this coming session, building on his 2 previous years. He's kind of punched them up a little bit. Mm-hmm. I think they see him coming.
And I think that's a theme you see with these new legislators is they come in, they have a lot of great ideas, a lot of them have been at the local level, and they have thoughts on what they can do. Then they run into the wall of special interests in Sacramento. Sorry, we represent special interests, but they do run into those, and it kind of changes their perspective. And I think 2 years in, you see a different legislator that has an eye towards what is possible. And that's when you really start seeing these interesting bills come out. Because, as Michael said, the low-hanging fruit has been picked. And so when they ask for housing bills and we come with, things that are transformative, are going to make a difference, then they run into the issue of, this is politically very difficult.
And the other side of that, Mac, is that you lose champions like Nancy Skinner, right? Mm-hmm. She's gone. And Nancy all the good work, 330, we know the work she did, but she put in the work. Scott Wiener, while he waits to decide what Pelosi does, he's out next year. And we all know Scott Wiener's a lightning rod on everything, but really on housing. So the other side of that is losing expertise, folks that do know how it works. And now, that's a very good point, Stephen, how these guys have to get a couple years under their belt before they even know where the bathroom is, quote unquote, or where who the policy experts are, or what you can get through. And then, of course, layer in all of this is the governor's election. Mm-hmm. I heard an interesting one this week, which is Kamala should come back and run for Oakland mayor. It's like, oh, really? If she can fix Oakland, she could be president again, right? I was like, oh, okay, that'll work. But we know the whole lineup for governor, and if Kamala's going to run for governor, or who's going to run for governor. But that also is going to impact housing, because the legislature and a Democrat supermajority does what the governor wants. So that's another dynamic, I think, coming down the road next year, in 2 years, 26.
And there's a deep field for the governor's race, I understand. Mm-hmm.
Everybody's running for governor. Yeah. Beth, are you running for governor too? You're not running for governor? Betty Yee, Tony Atkins, our superintendent of public education, who, by the way, says he has 75,000 acres of surplus land on school districts and wants to build housing. Anyone wants to know? The Rob Bonta's rumored to come back. Antonio Villaraigosa in LA is thinking about running.
Lieutenant Governor.
I mean, she was supposed to run. Yeah. Eleni Koulakis is running as well. So she's got all the money. That's the big one.
All right. I want to ask a few quick hitter questions here. Can you rate the 2024 housing legislative session on 1 to 10, with 10 being transformative and 1 being a dud?
It's a loaded question.
I'd say 7. But I do other things too. I was part of all the AI legislation. Wiener was trying to regulate artificial intelligence and how companies do it. We did a lot of bills on AI this year that will regulate, I think, for a good measure. GM passed a lemon law bill. They were so tired of being hung up in court on being sued over their cars. That got done in the last week. But I think the permit extension bill, the builder's remedy bill, just big housing bills this year. And of course, Buffy working on the malls bill was, I'd put it at a 7.
I'm a little more pessimistic. I say 6.5. You know, because there were big ideas, like I'm thinking of Senator Alvarez's Coastal Commission bill on ADUs, where he wanted to really, harmonize the ADU law with Coastal Commission regulation, and it was basically chopped down in committee. There were some big swings that didn't quite make it, and while I love tinkering with past legislation to make it more effective, and that's a good thing, it's not exactly like your headline grabbing session. So, but that speaks to the point where those headline grabbing ones, the ones that are left, CEQA, Coastal Commission, labor. I mean, who wants to deal with that?
Well, and it's easy to forget that budget impacts everything. We started the year with, what was it, 80 billion deficit, and by the time they moved stuff around, we got it down to 35, but the deficit hovers over everything and impacts what you can and cannot do, and while revenue's up, the deficit's going to be the big specter in the room next year, too.
Yeah. We've only got a $2 billion deficit next year, so looking great.
$2 billion?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Stephen, your comment on ADUs reminded me that you had, I think, some good insight last night on how housing bills work through the committee process and where they get stalled. I'm wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, the committee process is about radical transparency, right? It's about giving every stakeholder an opportunity to weigh in and fully vet proposals. It's about having experts and the committee consultants see different angles, take input from agencies and affected parties, and it's great. It's great that we do that. It's great that we really, make it a public process. That being said, there are so many bites at the apple for a piece of legislation and so many hands on it that a lot of times by the time it gets, something's introduced, it's got this great vision, it's got a really clear goal, and by the time each committee has taken, put their mark on it, at the end, it waters it down significantly. We've seen a trend of bills being double referred a lot now, sometimes triple referred, so that's 3 committees in each house. And every committee wants to make their mark, and every chair wants to make their mark, and it ends up just being, I'll say legislation by committee, that's what it's supposed to be, but it ends up being a challenge.
Gets watered down, but that's kind of the process too, right? You think that all the input is making it better. Of course, if you have an idea and it gets worse, and you're like, well, that's not my idea anymore.
Yeah, and you get these really interesting situations where the chair is forcing amendments on an author, and they make them stand up there and say, so, do you enthusiastically accept these amendments? And they say, yes, I accept them.
Yeah.
Kabuki theater, as we say.
That's right, that's what we say.
All right, my first lightning round question was a complete failure, but I'm hoping.
We had one already?
Oh, we were supposed to just say like a number and that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
It was a thunderstorm, slow roll.
Okay.
If I want one bill number that you think is going to be the most impactful bill of 2024.
937 and
1893.
The joint bill with Patterson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's
extending the permits.
Permit extension.
Because of economic difficulties, you now get 18 months to extend your permits.
Okay. And then looking ahead, or sorry, what was your?
1893, the Housing Accountability Act
Gotcha.
update and reform.
All right, a year from now, do you think you're going to rate 2025 higher or lower than 2024 on my transformative to dud scale?
Lower.
Higher.
No, these guys don't know what they're doing. We got a bunch of newbies now.
But they got that energy.
Right?
They're excited. They're going to do great things.
It'll be 6, not 6.5.
All right, switching a little bit to what your role is. What should our audience here today know about working with the Sacramento lobbying team? And can you provide a few examples of how you've delivered successes for clients in this region, or generally?
My mom still doesn't know what I do. My mom says, "I hope you got a good government job, son, with a pension." I was like, I tell my kids, everyone needs an advocate. And essentially what lobbyists are advocates for a position. So whether you have to talk to your teacher or whether you got to talk to your boss, it sure would be nice to have an advocate in between there to speak your point or say the things you may be uncomfortable saying. That being said, it's the classic, if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. So having an advocate for you in Sacramento allows you to have your voice heard. And particularly now, some would say, well, Mike, can't I just go talk to Greg and tell him? No, because there's other folks around here that also have people talking to them. So your individual concern, it's really citizen advocacy, citizen engagement, right? And a lobbyist, I think, helps your voice be a little bit louder and helps members of the legislature appreciate your point of view so it impacts their decision making.
Yeah, absolutely right about being at the table. And the other thing I'll say is that it helps you, have a force multiplier for your perspective, because you might agree with folks in other jurisdictions around the state on how to approach something, and you're working with them and working with a lobbyist who can see the whole picture and connect you with a coalition of folks who all have the same perspective. That gives you much bigger voice than going by yourself to talk to the legislature. So accessing that kind of like bigger ecosystem is really an important point.
On bills, Meg, I'd point to that GM bill that I got brought into the very end, but just so folks appreciate the sausage making, the trial lawyers started working with GM and Ford to come up with some way to fix lemon law. And they came up with an answer 1 week before the end of session. And so they got this bill through 1775 in the last week of session, which, we all know when session ends January 1st, but as time crunches, people get things done there. But for me, I think it's that permit extension bill that was a good one.
All right, so I also want to touch on, I think, a point that we talked about at the beginning with the funding for the Attorney General's Office and Department of Housing and Community Development. How often do you liaise with agencies that have more of an enforcement role or an administrative regulatory role in helping clients navigate the process?
Well, squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? I mean, you got to have someone advocating for you with agencies just like you would with a legislator or with the city council or with the county. There's a lot of priorities at HCD in the accountability unit, and so just having someone to elevate that is important, and that is something that we often do, is just highlight issues going on for them. It's kind of a collaborative approach when possible. So yeah, I think we work with them a lot.
Yeah, I think, the Attorney General before never weighed in on housing issues. This is brand new. Mm-hmm. And I think we're really watching something unique, the Attorney General coming after local cities, right? I mean, that's huge. So that's new. Now, we were all nervous because all of a sudden, is this going to stop now because now all the focus shifts to DC? We'll see. That's what the special session was, giving him money so he'll have money to sue and won't have money to do some of the housing enforceability acts he's been working on. I think they will do both. I think he realizes, particularly as he runs for governor, there's politics in everything. Putting his face in some of these local jurisdictions makes a difference if he decides to run. HCD, you have to talk to them, right? In fact, they come to us and ask about how can they be more effective. So it's kind of a two-way street over there.
Okay. Super helpful.
Yeah.
Before we switch over to audience questions, I do want to try some more lightning round on you. And you just touched on this, but Gavin Newsom's priorities in 2025, fighting Trump or fighting for housing? If you were a betting person.
Trump.
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 Okay. All right, which one issue area do you think the legislator will try to tackle this housing legislation session? And I've got a few: California Environmental Quality Act, Coastal Act, Building Code Reform, Development Impact Fees, or Condo Defect, or none of the above.
Well, I know for a fact condo defect ain't coming up.
Off the venue, yeah.
Right.
I think Coastal Commission's coming back. We saw a funny bill introduced on the first day from a Republican member going after the Vandenberg Space Force Base Coastal Commission decision, basically saying whatever the Coastal Commission said about that is annulled. I don't know if they can do that, but he's going to try to do it. But the fact that you got bipartisan, concern about the Coastal Commission going off the rails there is, I think it's indicative that there's going to be some movement there this year.
Yeah. No on CEQA. I mean, we'll tinker on it, but no one has the political will and push to get it through. Because it is the in-between year between 26, the election year, you might see something. I'm not sure what it is. Every year, for me, I love watching the bill that you didn't expect to come up, that comes up and consumes all of the administration. Like last year was AI. Scott put out AI just all the way along. AI was there. So we're waiting to see what that'll be.
All right. Any bills that died in 2024 that you expect to come back in 2025?
The Coastal Commission, Alvarez bills. I think he's gone on to something. He's licked his wounds, but I think he's figured it out. I think that comes back. It's more streamlining for ADUs in the coastal zone with the Coastal Commission.
This was going to be controversial, but there was a bill sponsored by the Carpenters Union to require prevailing wage on low-income housing tax credit projects. And this kind of was a fight that was bubbling under the surface in the legislature. It did make it through the process. The governor vetoed it. It is coming back.
Yes.
And it just shows, labor is teaming up with housing advocates on one side. They're advocating for better wages on the other side. That puts the affordable developers at odds with them in some places, where they sponsor bills with them at other places. Strange bedfellows, as we said. But that one, that mixed things up, and it's coming back.
That's a good call. I agree. I think labor is going to be more involved I think it's a recruitment tool for them. Hey, get a good job building houses, come join the Carpenters. But yeah, that's a good call. That's the one.
All right, well, I have lots more questions, but I do want to give everybody in the audience the opportunity to pick some brains.
From the assembly member.
Oh.
Supervisor, sorry.
So great to see you guys again. Goss Williams, Santa Barbara County Supervisor for 30 more days. I want to ask you, because everybody at CSAC is really struggling with this Coastal Commission aspect of housing. Around here, we need rezones of ag land, right? So while having housing be a criteria of jurisdiction for Coastal Commission sounds a little scary to a lot of people. Our production in the coastal zone is zero in the unincorporated area, so it can't get worse. So I'm just wondering, is there some logic to supporting having housing in as a criteria in the coastal area?
I think so. I mean, that's what I think Alvarez is learning, Doss. I feel like, first you go up and they crush you, then you go up and you make a little hayway. So to me, it feels like this is his year where he might look at, ag land's hard, right? I mean, that's breadbasket of California, but the need for housing's there. So I think he's going to try again.
I think there's interesting constituencies there. I mean, for one thing, farm worker housing is a big issue. It's a priority for the Assembly Speaker, and farm worker housing near the place where farm workers work makes a lot of sense, especially as we're trying to reduce VMT and other things. And ag land has protections through a variety of different regulatory regimes. We got CEQA, we got Williamson Act, and Coastal Commission. It's also there. So, is there work to be done to harmonize that? Yes, I think so, and I think there's a potential coalition there.
The good thing is with new members, you might see new ideas. And that's the one thing that in 3 years, once they figure out where everything is, there might be a new approach that we haven't learned yet, or someone may have that.
Thanks, Mac, and to our wonderful panelists. I have a question for you about League of Cities as a lobbying organization. And when I served as in the City of Santa Barbara Planning Commission, I heard a great deal about the tension and the discord between League of Cities and our state legislature, specifically our legislators who are housing champions. So I would appreciate your thoughts on where League of Cities is now, how it factors into the mix of lobbying entities and its relationship with the state legislature. Thanks.
We have a good working relationship with the League of Cities, in case anyone's out there. But, you know, a lot of times it's collegial. You know, a lot of times we don't agree on the end point, but in my experience, they're very focused on, you know, if it's going to happen, let's make it work for the cities, because that's the way that the legislature's been going. They kind of know that, you know, things are going to get through, and they need to make it the best they can for their members. So, you know, it's been good.
That's a very good question, because right now I wouldn't want to be with the League of Cities, because they get rolled all the time. The bill comes up on housing and everyone's for it, and then the league comes up and the cities come up and they go no, 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 and everyone kind of looks away and then passes the bill. It's right? I mean, we all know most housing's local, and so the decisions are made locally, so you got to have that relationship, you know, whether they appreciate the state coming down and giving me covers because no one wants me to do more, or they actually want to do something. That tension still exists. You mentioned that initiative that would ban all or reverse all state decisions. That's sort of the thing, you know, that could happen. It didn't come back in 18, that initiative. I think it could come back as more of these laws come. I don't know if the league's been beat into submission yet, but the tension still exists, and I don't see any let up of more bills from the state level until we see increases in production at the local level. That guy's got a rough job, the League of Cities lobbyist.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your comments today. I was wondering what legislative opportunities you see for encouraging ownership housing production within our communities.
Everyone remember SB2 or any realtors out here? You know, the $75 on every dock for housing. Buffy Wicks and Tony Thurman were talking to me about opening that up again to maybe figure out if you could get some money from that to help with ownership as part of that transaction. Stephen said it best, a lot of folks talk about it, but when it comes to money, because our prices are so high, CalHFA tried to do a down payment assistance program. We saw all that money go quickly. Tony Atkins wanted to do $1 billion a year for 10 years to help with down payment assistance, but I think until we get our prices in alignment, the state can't really have a role, because that's really, we need to reduce costs. And I so appreciate Shane talking about supply and demand, because I've been saying that in the legislature for 8 years and no one believes me. If we build more, prices go down. I try to give them the reference like Eddie Murphy in Trading Places on bacon, right? If you have more bacon, prices come down, right? I mean, but no, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, you got it. It's like we can't subsidize our way out of homeownership because the prices are so high. The same way we can't subsidize our way out of affordable, because an affordable unit is, you know, climbing up to $1 million to build now. So I think right now probably a housing bond is a potential path forward if homeownership can be baked into that, or, you know, SB2. But it's got to come. The money's got to come from somewhere.
And please appreciate, you know, we haven't even talked about homelessness. The legislature, I think, looks at homelessness before ownership. I mean, you said it best. Everyone says it in the beginning, but then when the rubber meets the road, it's okay. People don't want to see those encampments on the street. And so I think that money that could go for ownership feels like it's going towards homeless or helping with homelessness?
So I heard the gentleman on the left over here mention something about equity and groups like that. I know that Michael Tobes in 2002 did some condo conversions, Northtown, and allowed us workforce that it was stipulated as such. I know that in Arizona, hundreds of thousands of homes came up, and the equity groups back east ended up buying them up, and the new homeowners hopefully ended up renting at the prices that they would have paid for mortgages, right? What do we have that I can tell people in California that they have working for them that works for them instead of against them on these developments that will be allowed?
That's a good question.
That is a good question. My first thought was the ADU assistance there, but there's no money for that. The budget went.
Yeah, I was gonna say, there's not a lot that you can say, unfortunately.
You mean in financial assistance or housing being built?
A stipulation that says if you're going to build that, and we allow that like a builder's remedy or something that's scooting by under the wires, then that workforce housing, I mean, it was substantial. There are like 42 units there, and then we've moved on, most of us, and done what Mr. Phillips said, is we moved up to something else and opened that up for younger families, which really makes sense.
You know, I don't think there's something like that, like Stephen said, but one of the things I'm impressed with is modular building. There's a group in LA, SOLA LA, that's beginning to mass produce modulars that they can build like Tetris for 1, 2, 3, 4s and stack them up. I think, you know, if we can figure out how to do that without labor interfering, that could be a potential to do that. But modular construction, there's a plan in Vallejo that's trying to do that. We're trying to figure out how to do that, but that might be a thought. But generally, no, because it costs.
Yeah, the one thing I've seen in that space is community land trusts really working to purchase housing and then provide it to folks that are not going to be able to participate in the market otherwise. We have a client that specifically works for people with severe developmental disabilities and helping them to find permanent housing, and through a land trust model. So actually, usually it's the parents pool together money and they purchase this land and build housing on it, which will be there for their children in perpetuity, kind of taking it out of the market forces and just allowing them to have that housing. So that's one model we've seen. But right now, it's small scale and experimental.
Yeah.
That's really addressed.
Sorry.
So I'll jump in here. Santa Barbara County just went through the housing element update process, and we've moved into the implementation phase. I think a lot of folks that haven't been following this issue as closely were kind of surprised at the numbers that the county and local cities had to meet in order to achieve their regional housing needs obligation. And the state has put somewhat draconian provisions in the law to require certain densities, certain size projects.
Are you a League of Cities lobbyist?
People make this argument. I'm wondering if there's any movement towards creating better incentives for local agencies to go above and beyond the floor that the state sets in order to deliver better outcomes.
You know, I think the state can, you know, they've got carrots, they've got sticks, but as long as the local political dynamics stay the same, they're just swimming upstream, and everything is going to be, you know, fought every step of the way. And so, no, I don't think that the state can ultimately, you know, motivate local jurisdictions unless the people in the jurisdictions elect people that, you know, want to improve the communities.
Yeah. Little twist on that, I think we all know Huntington Beach and have heard about Huntington Beach pushing back. On Monday, Tony Strickland, who was the mayor there, was in town because he's going to be running for Janet Nguyen's seat, who's gone to the Board of Supervisors. So it'll be fascinating to see what a guy who was against all of these efforts from the state, being now in the state, how that plays out. Maybe the league will have an easier time with Tony there, but I think that's just a tension we're going to have to balance with going forward.
Actually, I'm just going to jump in with a quick plug for our closing panel, which features from HCD's Housing Accountability Unit, Lisa Krause. So we're going to be continuing this conversation later. It all goes together, guys. There's a mastermind behind this.
It works. There's a rhythm to this.
Indeed. I actually had a question for you. So obviously we've been talking a lot about funding restrictions and this idea of the low-hanging fruit of moderate housing, home ownership, that then just is the first, I guess, fruit to fall off the truck, right? Because there's no will and there's no money. And then we're being told to advocate. How do we advocate for money for moderate income housing?
I mean, that one, like I said, you can't go it alone. You got to get with a coalition of folks around the state, because there are advocates for moderate income and workforce housing everywhere, but they need to have a voice that's equal or greater than the voices advocating for other priorities. And so, joining organizations that advocate for that, that's the way to do it.
Who do we join locally? I'm sorry, I'm going to keep pushing
Locally?
this because
Yeah.
you have a group of very invested people here. So tell us what to do.
I'd share, we represent Habitat, and in January 25th, Habitat attacks the Capitol and goes to every single office, and I think there's like 150 people up there when Habitat goes, but I think making those messages unique, and I heard someone here from Habitat, but that's where you can begin, is when they go up, that you can start that voice, hey, I'm from Monterey, we need more money, and then the next group that goes up does the same. So, it's coalition work.
Mm-hmm. And it's not transparent. The budget process, if the legislature is a black box, the budget process is a black box within a midnight sphere of a black hole. It's really hard to understand what's going on there. A lot of it happens behind closed doors and at leadership. And so you've got to be out there, you've got to be loud, you've got to be working, the public relations side, you've got to be in the Capitol, like Michael said, showing up, doing legislative days and doing it with a voice that legislators can't ignore.
Yeah, with the League of Cities.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hello. This question goes back to home ownership, and I was wondering if you're hearing anything about extending mortgage terms from 30 years to 40, 50, 60 to make it more affordable.
That's a good question.
Have you heard that?
No. All I hear is 15. Gets you out of it quicker, right? Or 10, but no, I haven't heard 40. I guess that's our banker friends. That sounds like a good bill idea.
Yeah.
Scott Wiener introduced reducing insulin prices, so why can't we reduce or increase mortgage years? Let's get the bankers to do that. I like that. Or build more housing so the prices come down.
All right, well, I think that's our time. Thank you all for being engaged and helping me out with questions, and thank you to Michael and Stephen.
Thanks, Mac.
Thanks, Mac. Appreciate you, brother.
Great session. Thank you, Mac. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Stephen. We will go to another 15-minute break. We'll come back with the sponsor video, and then we will head into our last and closing panel, where we'll learn about navigating the layers of housing implementation. Grab a coffee. We'll see you back here at 11:45. Thank you.